the early months of 1916, Europe was already drowning in blood. The First World War had been raging for more than a year, yet neither side had achieved a decisive victory. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, millions of soldiers were locked in place, trapped inside muddy trenches that scarred the continent. Every major offensive ended the same way. Enormous casualties, minimal territorial gain, and a growing sense that the war had no clear end. In northeastern France, one location was chosen to break this deadlock. Its name was Verdun. To the German High Command, Verdun was far more than a strategic position. It was a symbol of French national pride, a fortress city that France could not afford to lose. More importantly, it was the perfect target for a new and ruthless strategy. A battle not meant to seize land, but to destroy an enemy army through exhaustion and relentless pressure. The idea was brutally simple. Force France to defend Verdun at any cost, then unleash such overwhelming firepower that the French army would slowly bleed itself to death. What followed was not a swift campaign, but a nightmare that stretched across nearly 10 months. Artillery fire never truly stopped. Entire hills vanished under explosions. Forests were turned into wastelands of shattered trees and poisoned soil. Soldiers fought not for victory, but merely to stay alive. Verdun became the longest battle of the Great War, a place where time lost its meaning and survival became the only objective. It was a battle of endurance, a battle of attrition, and a battle that pushed human limits beyond anything previously imagined. Today, we will explore how Verdun became a machine designed to consume men, why it refused to end, and how its legacy reshaped modern warfare forever. This is the story of the longest battle of the Great War. By the end of 1915, the First World War had reached a brutal stalemate. The early hopes of swift victories and decisive maneuvers had vanished, replaced by a continuous line of trenches stretching across Western Europe. Millions of men lived underground, surrounded by mud, rats, disease, and the constant threat of artillery fire. Commanders on both sides searched desperately for a way to break the deadlock, but every major offensive seemed to deliver the same result: enormous losses for minimal gain. It was within this atmosphere of frustration and exhaustion that the idea for Verdun was born. For the German High Command, led by General Erich von Falkenhayn, victory no longer meant capturing vast territories. Falkenhayn believed that France, not Britain or Russia, was the true backbone of the Allied war effort in the West. If the French army could be broken, the war might be won. Rather than attempting another massive breakthrough, he proposed a new approach, a battle designed to exhaust France's manpower and morale. Verdun, with its powerful forts and deep emotional significance to the French people, appeared to be the ideal target. Verdun was not chosen by accident. For centuries, it had guarded the eastern approaches to France, and had become a symbol of national resistance. Losing Verdun would be unthinkable for the French government and military leadership. Falkenhayn believed that France would commit every available soldier to defend it, no matter the cost. Once those troops were drawn in, German artillery would destroy them in overwhelming numbers. In his mind, Verdun would become a battlefield where France would be forced to bleed itself dry. On the French side, the situation was already dire. Years of fighting had drained manpower, strained industry, and shaken public confidence. Yet Verdun remained a sacred place in the national imagination. French commanders understood its symbolic importance, but they also underestimated the scale of the German plan. The defenses around Verdun existed, but many forts had been partially disarmed earlier in the war, as military doctrine shifted away from static fortifications. This decision would soon prove disastrous. On February 21, 1916, the silence around Verdun was shattered. Without warning, German artillery opened fire with a force never before seen. Thousands of guns bombarded the French positions, hurling millions of shells across a relatively small area. The earth shook continuously, trenches collapsed, and entire units were buried alive before they could even fire a shot. Survivors later described the bombardment as a never-ending storm of steel, where day and night became indistinguishable. When German infantry finally advanced, they moved through a landscape that no longer resembled a battlefield, but a ruined planet. Trees were splintered into matchsticks, the ground was torn open, and the air itself seemed poisoned by smoke and gas. French units, stunned and under-equipped, struggled to respond. Within days, key positions fell, including Fort Dalmont, one of the strongest fortresses in the Verdun system. Its capture shocked France and sent waves of panic through the French command. At this critical moment, General Philippe Pétain was placed in charge of the defense. Unlike many commanders of the era, Pétain understood that morale mattered as much as firepower. He reorganized supply lines, ensuring that fresh troops and ammunition could reach the front continuously. One road in particular, later known as the Sacred Way, became the lifeline of Verdun. Along it, an endless stream of trucks carried soldiers forward and wounded men back, day and night, without pause. Pétain also introduced a system of troop rotation. Instead of allowing units to be destroyed in place, divisions were regularly withdrawn and replaced. This meant that a vast portion of the French army would eventually pass through Verdun. While this reduced total collapse, it also ensured that Verdun's psychological impact would spread across the entire nation. Nearly every French family would be touched by the battle in some way. As weeks turned into months, Verdun became a grinding struggle with no clear front line. Positions were captured, lost, and recaptured repeatedly, sometimes within the same day. Artillery fire dominated everything. Soldiers learned that survival often depended less on bravery than on luck, whether a shell landed a few meters closer or farther away. The constant noise, the lack of sleep, and the sight of unburied bodies pushed many men to the edge of mental collapse. Despite enormous losses, neither side could afford to withdraw. For Germany, abandoning Verdun would mean admitting that the strategy had failed. For France, retreat would be a national humiliation. The battle took on a life of its own, feeding itself with fresh troops and resources, long after any original strategic logic had faded. Verdun was no longer about winning the war quickly. It was about not losing face, not breaking first. By the summer of 1916, Verdun had already become a symbol of industrialized slaughter. The original German objective to bleed France dry was being matched by Germany's own losses, yet the fighting continued, locked in a deadly equilibrium. Verdun had transformed into something unprecedented in human history, a battle without an endpoint, where survival itself became the only measurable success. In the next part, we will follow Verdun as it descends even deeper into chaos, where technology, terrain, and human endurance collided, and where the true cost of modern warfare became impossible to ignore. By mid-1916, the Battle of Verdun had evolved into something far beyond its original strategic purpose. What began as a calculated German plan had turned into a self-sustaining engine of destruction, driven by artillery, exhaustion, and an unyielding refusal from both sides to concede defeat. The front lines no longer moved in meaningful ways. Instead, the battle became a brutal cycle of attack, counterattack, and relentless bombardment, where survival was measured in hours rather than days. Artillery ruled Verdun. More shells were fired there than in any previous battle in history. The ground was struck so repeatedly that it lost all natural shape, transformed into a landscape of craters, shattered trenches, and exposed corpses. Soldiers often described the earth as constantly trembling, as if the land itself were alive and in pain. Even when the guns briefly fell silent, the ringing in their ears never truly stopped, a reminder that the violence could resume at any moment. Life at Verdun was defined by extremes. Heat and cold, hope and despair, calm and terror existed side by side. Men slept whenever they could, often standing or crouched in mud-filled trenches. Food arrived late, or not at all. Water was frequently contaminated, and disease spread. Hygiene became impossible. Uniforms stiffened with dirt and sweat, and wounds quickly turned infected. The presence of death was constant, not dramatic, but routine. Bodies lay where they fell, sometimes used as cover or markers in a battlefield where traditional landmarks no longer existed. Psychological strain proved as deadly as physical injury. Continuous shelling created a state of permanent tension. Soldiers flinched at every sound, even away from the front. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock, a condition poorly understood and often dismissed as cowardice. Men who could no longer speak, walk, or respond were sometimes sent back into combat after minimal rest. Verdun exposed the limits of the human nervous system, revealing that courage alone could not withstand industrial warfare. For the French army, Verdun became a test of national endurance. The phrase "they shall not pass" was repeated endlessly, not just as a slogan, but as a psychological shield against despair. Defending Verdun was no longer a military task, it was a moral obligation. Units rotated in and out of the front, but the memory of Verdun followed the soldiers wherever they went. The battle became embedded in the collective consciousness of France, shaping how the nation understood sacrifice and survival. On the German side, expectations of a swift collapse of French resistance faded quickly. German soldiers faced the same conditions, the same mud, the same artillery, the same exhaustion. As losses mounted, doubts began to spread among officers and men alike. The idea of bleeding France dry had not accounted for the equal cost paid by Germany. Verdun was consuming both armies at a rate that no strategic calculation could justify. The fighting itself became increasingly fragmented. Small units clashed over shattered ridges, ruined forts, and nameless craters. Gains were measured in meters, sometimes reclaimed at enormous costs within hours. New weapons, including flamethrowers and poison gas, were introduced in attempts to break the stalemate. While these technologies added terror to the battlefield, they rarely delivered decisive results. Instead, they deepened the sense that Verdun was a place where every innovation simply found new ways to kill without ending the battle. As summer turned to autumn, the wider war began to intrude on Verdun. The British and French launched the Battle of the Somme to relieve pressure on the French army. While this shifted some German resources away from Verdun, it did not bring immediate relief. The fighting at Verdun continued, locked in its own momentum. Commanders on both sides felt trapped by the battle they could not abandon and could not win. The physical environment grew worse with time. Rain turned the cratered ground into a sea of mud, swallowing men, equipment, and wounded soldiers alike. Evacuating casualties became increasingly difficult. Stretcher-bearers risked their lives moving across exposed terrain, often under fire. Many wounded men waited for hours or days, their fate uncertain, their suffering unseen. Verdun was not only killing soldiers, it was erasing the boundary between life and death. Despite everything, the battle endured. Orders continued to flow. Attacks were planned and executed with grim routine. For the men at the front, the war narrowed to immediate concerns: finding shelter, avoiding shells, helping a wounded comrade. Grand strategies and political goals felt distant and irrelevant. Verdun reduced war to its most basic form: endurance against overwhelming force. By late 1916, it was clear that Verdun had become a symbol of something larger than victory or defeat. It represented the terrifying efficiency of modern warfare and the human cost required to sustain it. The battlefield stood as a warning, even as the fighting continued, that industrialized war could consume entire nations without delivering resolution. In the final part, we'll examine how the Battle of Verdun finally began to end, what it left behind, and why its legacy still defines how we understand modern war today. By the autumn of 1916, the Battle of Verdun had reached a point of exhaustion that few could have imagined when it began. The original German strategy had long since collapsed, buried under the same shells that devastated the battlefield. Leadership changes within the German high command signaled a quiet admission of failure, even as the fighting continued. Verdun had not broken France, but it had revealed a darker truth. Modern war could sustain itself long after logic, strategy, or hope had disappeared. For the French army, the focus gradually shifted from survival to recovery. With pressure reduced as German forces were diverted elsewhere, French commanders began carefully planned counteroffensives. These were not bold, sweeping attacks, but methodical advances designed to reclaim lost ground and restore morale. Forts that had fallen earlier in the year were retaken, often at tremendous cost. Each regained position was celebrated not for its military value, but for what it represented: proof that France had endured. Yet victory at Verdun was never clear-cut. When the fighting finally slowed in December 1916, the front lines rested close to where they had begun. Nearly 10 months of continuous combat had produced little territorial change. What remained was a battlefield so devastated that it could barely be recognized as part of the natural world. Villages had vanished. Forests no longer existed, and the soil itself was saturated with metal and human remains. Verdun was not reclaimed. It was abandoned by war itself. The human cost defied comprehension. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or permanently scarred. Entire generations carried the physical and psychological consequences of Verdun long after the guns fell silent. For many veterans, the war never truly ended. Memories of constant bombardment, fear, and loss returned in moments of silence, shaping lives long after uniforms were put away. Verdun became a symbol not only of sacrifice, but of trauma on a national scale. In France, the battle took on an almost sacred meaning. Verdun was remembered as a place where the nation had refused to break. Monuments were raised, ceremonies held, and the fallen honored as defenders of the homeland. Yet beneath this narrative of resilience lay an unspoken understanding that endurance had come at a terrible price. Verdun was both a source of pride and a reminder of what modern war demanded from those who fought it. For Germany, Verdun represented a turning point of a different kind. The failure of the battle undermined confidence and strategies based on attrition alone. The realization that industrial warfare could drain even the strongest nations forced German leaders to rethink their approach, contributing to decisions that would reshape the war in 1917 and beyond. Verdun exposed the limits of military power when faced with equally determined resistance. Beyond the immediate participants, Verdun changed how the world understood war. It demonstrated that technology had outpaced human endurance. Artillery, machine guns, and industrial production had created a form of conflict where victory no longer depended on decisive battles, but on the ability to absorb suffering. Verdun showed that modern war could become endless, consuming resources and lives without delivering resolution. The landscape of Verdun itself became a permanent memorial. Long after the war, unexploded shells remained buried beneath the soil, and certain areas were declared uninhabitable. Nature slowly returned, but scars remained visible. Craters, twisted metal, and shattered stone preserved as silent witnesses. Verdun stood as a reminder that war leaves marks not only on people, but on the earth itself. In the years that followed, military thinkers studied Verdun closely. Some saw it as a cautionary tale, a warning against wars of attrition. Others viewed it as an unavoidable consequence of modern industry and mass mobilization. Either way, Verdun influenced doctrine, strategy, and memory. It became a reference point for understanding both the possibilities and the horrors of 20th century warfare. The longest battle of the Great War did not end with a clear winner. Instead, it ended with exhaustion, grief, and a deeper awareness of what war had become. Verdun did not decide the outcome of the First World War, but it reshaped the way nations approach conflict. It forced the world to confront a new reality, that in modern war, survival itself could be mistaken for victory. Today, Verdun is quiet. The guns are silent, the trenches overgrown, and the forests once again stand tall. Yet beneath that, calm lies a history written in blood and steel. The battle serves as a reminder that endurance has limits, that symbols can demand unimaginable sacrifices, and that the true cost of war is often paid long after the fighting ends. This is why Verdun endures in memory, not as a triumph, but as a warning from the past.